Hi, I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State. Welcome to class today. The class is Ethics and Values, and today we're still on our business ethics section. We have with us President William Cederberg. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Dr. Cederberg has been the president at Utah Valley State College for the past several years, and it's been just a pleasure having you here. I'm going to introduce you to the students and then come back and have you tell us a little bit about your background. But over here we have Cassie and Lloyd, and on this side over here we have Aaron and John. And it's such a pleasure having you here today with us, President Cederberg, especially for this discussion, which I think often applies to our chief executive officers in business and other areas. But could you tell us about yourself?
Well, I hope you're not going to equate me with Machiavelli
Never.
right off the bat with that. So,
none of us
anyway,
would do that.
For a very quick introduction, grew up in Nebraska, then Minnesota, went to graduate school at Michigan State University. I got my PhD in political science there and studied Machiavelli in that light. Went on to teach at Michigan State. Ended up in the legislature for 12 years, which I saw a variety of different political strategies used. Became president of Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan. Did that for 9 years. And then my wife and I moved out here in 2003 to take over the presidency of Utah Valley State College. And we've enjoyed it a great deal. And we have 2 children. And so it's great to be here. It's great to see the students here. Look forward to the conversation.
Oh, it's wonderful having you here as well. And you've just made some terrific changes here at our institution. So.
Well, I haven't been fired yet, so that's something. So.
You know, you look at a piece like this that was written right at the beginning of the 1500s, and you say, how can it withstand the test of time? How can it stay around so long? Why does something like this stay around so long?
Well, I think there's a function of age. You know, as you get older, you realize that there aren't a lot of really totally new things that are going on in the world, and so when it comes to the basic human relation principles and the structures of government, the issues are fairly similar to what they were when Aristotle was writing or when Plato was writing. There's just such wisdom throughout the ages that we can learn about. So the conditions might change, but a lot of the fundamentals remain the same.
And he's got some fundamentals for us.
He does have a lot of fundamentals.
You know, you hear that name, Cassie, Niccolo Machiavelli, and you think manipulation.
Right.
But tell us a little bit about him and maybe what inspired him to write The Prince.
Well, Machiavelli lived in Florence, and he was very, very patriotic to the state of Florence and its welfare, and tried to get in good with the Medici family, or Medici, sorry, we're in Italy, by writing The Prince. And they didn't like it very much. They were very powerful, and he didn't gain their trust through that. But he was exiled, and it was during his exile that he wrote all his principal works, including The Prince. And it's been known it's received a lot of censure for being just diabolical and inhumane and just evil.
So is it really that bad, John?
In a lot of ways, yeah, because he does abandon, for leaders, he abandons kind of almost a moral accountability. And so in ways it is, but then in other ways it's very descriptive, and it just kind of explains how things are kind of in politics at times, and it's insightful, that's for sure. Okay,
how about it, Aaron? What do you think about this, about Niccolo Machiavelli and The Prince?
I think that I don't know that Machiavelli would have actually believed these things. Like Cassie was saying, he was in exile. He was trying to get in with the Medici family. It may be that he was writing this to people he thought were already ruthless and thought this is what they wanted to hear. Because I find it hard to believe that anyone in actual practice. It's like, but it's just me.
Go ahead, Cassie.
The thing about Machiavelli is that he doesn't really talk about things in ethical terms. It's more almost the way he describes what needs to be done, in Florence in medical terms. And in fact, there's this quote, it's just really funny what he said. He said, seditious people should be amputated before they infect the whole state. And so, that's really, he just sees it as kind of an emergency situation, and this is what needs to be done. But he totally separates it from ethics and just political this is how you stay in power. This is how to maintain power.
Okay, and so President, we see this fellow who really is patriotic, and he loves the prince, and he wants to give the prince the best of advice and say, this is how you're going to stay in power and not get overthrown. And he says, I know it might not sound like what you're used to, but you're given special privileges. Are the chiefest officers in business and education and politics, do they have some special privileges like Machiavelli's handing to the prince?
Yes, I imagine they do. I think that it really goes back to a fundamental understanding of human nature. And forgive me, I know this is more business and ethics and political science, but just a little bit about political science. In the political science philosophy tradition, there's really two tracks that people take. One is, Thomas Hobbes wrote about it, that government is formed to protect people against each other. And that's the basis of the Machiavelli writings, and that is that people are essentially evil, and if left alone to their own devices, will club each other and battle each other and shoot each other and claw each other away. And so government is needed to protect people. And in that light, Machiavelli gives us some direction as to how to maneuver within that environment. And of course, in 1500, it was a very tough age. I mean, the sense of humanity was not very great. Cruelty was very common. It was a tough life for people. The other strain in political science is the Rousseau strain that really came along in the 1700s and 1800s, in which talked about government being formed as a compact where people just kind of got together and said, how can we promote life by agreeing to form a government, and we'll make the world better for all of us. And so I think to understand Machiavelli, as I look at it from the political science background, is to understand that he takes off that people are essentially bad. And so if you're going to be the leader of this gang of hooligans, you have to be ruthless, and you have to know how to manipulate people, and you have to maneuver, and you have to have fear, but you can't go so far as being hated, because then you'll have a revolution in your hands. So it's in that light that Machiavelli writes. Now, from the current business world, I suspect you have that mixture of business leaders as well. You have some people that have asked, are people basically good, and you can appeal to their better senses? Then you have the servant leadership type approach and different things. Then you'll have some business leaders that'll say, no, you have to kick people in the butt once in a while to get them to do things, and that they're only there for the dollars. And so we really can have both traditions in the business world as well. I'm sure you take some CEOs that when asked, they'd say, well, if I just appeal to people's good side, positive side, we can form a great corporation or a great university. And we'll do that through servant leadership or by participatory management. Then you also have the other side that have asked. The CEO would say, boy, in my business, I really have to kick the behind of some of our employees to get them to going, and they're only there for the money, and they're only there to do it, so I've got to watch my back at all times. And I think you see both in the business world, and frankly, I think both strategies might be applicable based upon the circumstances a business find themselves in. So I don't think it's a clear-cut case that one is good and one is necessarily bad.
I couldn't agree more. And one of the reasons why we read The Prince by Machiavelli is that I think it makes our students well educated. And whether or not they agree with this or these strategies, they should know about them. And other books have come out talking about how to get power in business, and whether or not this is a mode of management that you'd like to use. You should know that management style exists. Cassie, and then others who also might have a question or comment for the president.
Sorry, just going along with what President Cedarberg was saying, Machiavelli a few times throughout this reading said, but men are a sorry lot. And I just thought that was really funny how just men
There's
are
also some real
pretty
sexist comments in there.
yeah.
The Machiavelli apparently didn't think much of women, because there's some references of how to keep women in line.
Oh, right.
And,
Yes. And one of the worst things you can do is, mess around with a guy's woman or property.
That's right, yeah, leave those alone.
Why even differentiate?
Go ahead and kill people, but do not mess around with their women or property.
And
that was
said in the same breath, there isn't any difference in Machiavelli's mind, perhaps.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, Lloyd?
I think it's interesting, and I'm not the greatest with Machiavelli, but there's as President Cedarburg said, this is the fundamentals of society that has persisted. In a lot of ways, you can see this as government without regulation and whatnot. And it's interesting how much the prince, or Machiavelli, appeals to appearance. It's not necessarily how the prince is, it's how he appears
perceived
to others.
That's right.
And he can do whatever he wants. So as long as the people think he's a certain way, that's what's important, because that's what's going to keep him in control and keep him. And you see that with businesses, with government. I mean, everywhere you see that. And it's really only when there's regulations to try to keep that from happening that it's able to be contained.
I think you're right on target. There's some great quotes in there about image is far more important than reality, and that if people have the image of the prince caring about society, that's what really counts. It isn't the reality of whether the prince has done anything in a positive way. I sort of think in the political light is kind of fascinating, because everybody I've known says that when they meet privately with President Bush, he's warm and very intelligent and very articulate and stuff, but that isn't the public image that's out there. And so it can sometimes work in reverse of what you expect.
I think so too, yeah. Very good observation on that. John, did you have a comment to make?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that you're right, that there are strategies that are present here that may be useful, but I also think, I read this and I think, if taken literally to its absolute extent, the consequences of something like Machiavellian philosophy would be dire. I mean, we would have a serious situation on our hands. I mean, do you think that's true?
Well, for fear of sounding like I'm defending the Machiavelli, I would soften it a little bit. If you look at military, if you look at the fact that when somebody signs up for the military and you go through boot camp and you're kind of totally dominated by a drill sergeant, and your rights are taken away from you, and your hair is shaved off, and there is a real element of the military of that manipulation of human spirit that Machiavelli really talks about. And you need to do that for the military. If you're going to ask somebody to run in and face having their head blown off or something in a war, you need to do that. And so, that would be on one extreme. And there, your leaders really need to be feared, but not hated, because you need that really strong power. On the other hand, if you're putting together a United Way campaign, probably the Machiavellian techniques aren't going to work so great. You need to appeal to people's better purposes in life. So I think there's a lot, if you look at Machiavelli's writing, I think you almost have to put it into context, both contextually where he was in 1500 when he wrote it, and how those principles might be applied. And in a crisis situation or in a militaristic setting, there might be more application for some of those techniques. So that's just a thought.
And I think that's where he goes the furthest in saying you may manipulate, you may be cruel, as with the military situations.
Yeah, clearly, he would be a pro-defense budget politician. I mean, I don't remember now, but if I recall correctly, there's a line in there that says you should, in the good times, you should build up your strength so you're ready in the bad times. And I think the pro-military folks would like that statement.
I do too. Well, let's go ahead and move right on into these readings then and dissect them a little bit. And could we have you read the first one for us, Cassie?
Sure. Being good can lead one to ruin. There is such a gap between how one lives and how one ought to live that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. For a man who wishes to make a vocation of being good at all times will come to ruin among so many who are not good. Hence it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity.
Erin, here we are in this ethics class, and the very first one, he's saying, don't be good. If somebody comes up to you with a gun, and you say, I am ethical, then you're going to be the one dead, probably.
Chances are. I think what he is pointing out is that anyone who tries to always do what ought to be done, who tries to maintain the ideal, will be sorely disappointed. He's saying that right off the bat, that you'll be disappointed with yourself and your actions, and you just can't do it. And so somebody who's a prince has to learn not to be good in order to not fall into this same trap, because you need to, at minimum, be confident in your action.
So, John, tell us about this, or is this going to be a secret?
What I think of when I hear this is I just think of it's in such stark opposition to everything we've talked about as it concerns Kant. I mean, Kant's saying you should do what you ought to, and no matter if it leads to your ruin. But here you got Machiavelli that's just saying the exact opposite. I think that's what strikes me about this passage.
And President, you brought up Hobbes, and this is very Hobbesian, isn't it? And what do you think about this, where he says, hey, if you're good, it can lead you to ruin?
I put it in light of, our students here are too young to remember Jimmy Carter. But when Jimmy Carter was president, I'm feeling old, when Jimmy Carter was president, he wanted his foreign policy to be based on good and human rights, and really went out there to promote what we would define as good. It didn't work very well in the cruel world of international politics, and he was followed by Ronald Reagan, who had a much more pragmatic approach and said, this is an evil world out there. We have to maneuver within that evil world, and was probably more successful in tearing down the Berlin Wall when he said, you know, the Soviet Union was an evil empire and stuff like that. And so, again, it comes back to these kind of two approaches, and I think what Machiavelli is saying here is, you know, there's such a gap between what we think we ought to do and the real world that don't be naive and foolish and be taken advantage of by not being a smart person that can manipulate in this other more evil world. So I'm not particularly stressed out by this particular quote, in the sense that I think on balance, I once had an opportunity to have a conversation with Henry Kissinger and talked about foreign policy. And Henry Kissinger's approach was in international relations, you really have to look at self-interest among the countries, not a grander, greater good. And that to really be successful, you have to manipulate the self-interest of the various countries. And so I find this quote not particularly distressing, although I think he went overboard in saying just reject good altogether.
But I think perhaps putting it in this Hobbesian light and saying you've got to be very self-interested, keep your eyes open, might be a better translation.
Fundamentally, it's easy to cross the boundary between kind of an individual sense of religiosity and governing. And, you know, I think that this quote talks about don't cross that line and make it sound like you're interested in a religious point of view.
Oh, I was just going to ask then, so this works pretty well for larger institutions and for governing and government, things like that, but what about people using this in their individual lives? Is that where it becomes more of a problem?
It would be. He's not writing this for us, so to speak. He's writing this for the prince. He's for the princes of industry as well.
It's really a government manual.
Yeah. And the rest of us aren't allowed. Even Plato said that rulers could lie. He gave them special powers and privileges. Kant wouldn't go that far, but we have other philosophers who say, in the name of the Republic, it's all right for you to lie. I don't think Plato would go this far and say, don't even bother being good. Let's go ahead and pull up the next quote, and Lloyd, would you read that one for us?
This is for the qualities of the prince. I say that all men, when they are spoken of, and particularly princes, since they are placed on a higher level, are judged by some of these qualities which bring them either blame or praise.
And let's continue on.
And this is why one is considered generous, another miserly. One is considered a giver, the other rapacious. One cruel, another merciful. One treacherous, another faithful. One effeminate and cowardly, another bold and courageous. One humane, another haughty. One lascivious, another chaste. One trustworthy, another cunning. One harsh, another lenient. One serious, another frivolous. One religious, another unbelieving, and the like.
Okay, what do you think about that list, Lloyd, where he keeps giving us balance? He's going to say one on this side and one on this side. What does he want out of the prince?
Well, I think he's in some sense he's telling the prince, look, you have to pick a side. You can't you're going to be seen one or the other. You need to pick a side, and that's how you're going to be understood and seen. And I think it's funny, and you see this in a lot of literature, how, especially in this time where they pick everything's good or evil. Everything's this dichotomy of one or the other. There's like no middle ground in these things. They don't seek after middle ground, they just seek one or the other, which goes a lot against what Aristotle is saying, where you have to find the golden mean. Instead of Machiavelli, I say there really is no golden mean, it's one or the other, pick it.
And how do you see him utilizing this as well? Thanks, Lloyd. John.
Who is that guy sitting there?
Yeah.
For now, I'm going to pass this one on to someone else.
To Aaron or me?
Aaron.
It doesn't matter. I'm glad to do it as well, Aaron.
Well, I just think that while Lloyd brought up a great point, I also think that what Machiavelli wants from the prince is for them to realize that regardless of if you're in the middle ground or not, people will judge you as one or the other. It doesn't matter what you are on the inside. That's where this appearance, I think, comes in at the very first. He's more directing the prince's attention to the fact that your subjects, other rulers, people will observe you and judge you as one or the other.
Okay, and that was the point that you'd made so well before, John. It's on page on the top of page 413, the second column, and right up there at the top, then he says, "It's too bad you can't be all of these things." And he shows us these black and white, as Lloyd mentioned. And then he says, "Too bad you can't be all of these things." But he says, "You need to have a pretty good reputation, but having some of these bad qualities as part of your reputation isn't so tough either." So. He's going to say he kind of wishes you could have all of these things in there. Well, let's move on to the next one. And would you read that for us, John?
Yes. Know how to escape the bad reputation. And I know that everyone will admit that it would be a very praiseworthy thing to find in a prince, of the qualities mentioned above, those that are held to be good. But since it is neither possible to have them nor to observe them all completely, because human nature does not permit it, a prince must be prudent enough to know how to escape the bad reputation of those vices that would lose the state for him, and must protect himself from those that will not lose it for him, if this is possible.
Okay, so John, it's just right into that advice that you gave us earlier. Any comments you want to make on it now?
Just that, he really is, there is really no moral accountability for certain actions with him. It is pure strategy. If this is going to benefit me as a ruler for the state, then this is what I'm going to do. And if it doesn't, then I'm not going to. And it's very cold in a way, and just strategy.
And President, do you think that perhaps politicians, top government leaders, as well as top business leaders always see their job in jeopardy, and they're always looking at those things that can make their job not be in jeopardy?
I don't think so. I think that you might assume that might be a base motive. I think more likely it has to do with one's sense of power and the intrinsic love of power. Lord Acton's quote about total power corrupts totally, and et cetera. So what this stuff really applies to, in my mind, are people that are really interested in power. And if you're really interested in power, you always got to look behind you to see who is behind you that might be interested in grabbing power from you. And so these kind of quotes here are that be strong, be vigilant, and never let those people come up from behind that might grab the power away from you. So I think, and there are a lot of people in the business world and the political world that are really interested in maintaining their power. And so they're willing to do some of these things in the prince that they would not otherwise if they didn't care about their sense of power.
Okay, and in fact, throughout the whole book of The Prince, and I hope that you'll all take the time to read it. I truly believe a well-educated person would read the entire book, and it's not that long. He talks about power, and maybe...
I think the core of the reading is really about power in a governmental setting, but the underlying principles of those power conversations can be applied to the business world very easy and very clearly. There's a statement in the literature that it's lonely at top, okay? And Machiavelli is certainly right along that line, that you have to be very careful. In fact, there's a great quote about be careful of people that come and give you advice, be in control. You go out and ask for advice and it's okay, but if somebody comes to you and say, And I think about that because I periodically feel compelled to give the governor and others advice. And it's really very interesting, the different reaction you get from some of these power brokers. Then if they ask you, they say, well, Bill, what do you think? Then it's quite different. Then when I come trucking up and say, Governor, you really ought to do this. So, well, thanks a lot. You know?
And Machiavelli's to be held at fault for the same thing. The Medicis did not like this advice.
That's
But
right.
he-
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, they didn't ask him for this advice. They didn't need that advice.
but he would love to be the person on the prince's shoulder saying, you know, now you project this positive image, and I'm gonna watch your back all the time and tell you who's coming after you.
Rereading this document, it really struck me that he wasn't there in the media age. Now we're doing this on TV and television, but if you read this from a media consultant point of view, it really is very fascinating because he's saying you can't be known for nuance in this media age. You know, nobody's going to know you well enough to know that, you know, there's 20% of you that feels comfortable doing this and 80% of you that feels uncomfortable doing this. They're going to be on this side or this side, and you pick and choose. And you should have the bulk of good things, but you should have enough negative things over here to keep people on their toes. So, I don't know, just reading it, it just hit me that if you're really interested in a very, 16th century discussion of media, it's a very fascinating conversation.
It fits there too.
It does, yeah.
Excellent observation. Cassie.
I was just thinking about, I don't know, his whole theory is very, or his way of implementing things is very unpredictable and kind of frightening because there's so much calculation involved. There's so much watching your back. It's not like with Kant where you know what you're going to do in all situations. It's very, you have to think about how it's going to affect you and your appearance in every different situation. That's a little bit unpredictable and scary.
Very good. In fact, would you go ahead and read our next quote for us,
Sure.
Cassie? Thanks.
On generosity. And so if a prince wants to maintain his reputation for generosity among men, it is necessary for him not to neglect any possible means of lavish display. In so doing, such a prince will always use up all his resources, and he will be obliged eventually, if he wishes to maintain his reputation for generosity, to burden the people with excessive taxes and do everything possible to raise funds. This will begin to make him hateful to his subjects, and, becoming impoverished, he will not be much esteemed by anyone.
Okay, so we're moving on into this concept that I call other people's money. But Aaron, tell us a little bit about what he's getting at here on generosity.
Well, I think it's interesting that what he's saying is that you should always look generous. And in order to look generous, you have to give, I guess the old Roman term of bread and circuses. You need to be putting on the show. You need to be giving everything away. And eventually that will run through your money. And therefore, you need to tax people excessively in order to get money back. But I think he's also warning at the same time that you need to be sure not to push that too far because, again, you want to be feared but not so hated that you're going to incite revolution.
In fact, he actually doesn't want taxes much. He's going to say, you better avoid that. That's when people won't like you. But, you know, if you can spend other people's money, you know, invade another country.
I'd like to follow up with Aaron a little bit about the bread and circuses. You know, that's a great tradition out of the Roman world and stuff. What do you think Machiavelli would say about the Olympics in Salt Lake City or something?
Oh gosh, I think that he'd say it's probably excellent for morale. He'd say it makes you look like a city that has something going on. It gives people an opportunity to come and see what you do right. But at the same time, he might say that if you mess up a little bit, you have a greater chance for
Just an interesting thought crossed my mind. Mitt Romney wants to be president of the United States. He's running for president, catapulted to national attention by saving the bread and circus here in Salt Lake City back in 2002, largely with private money. And so, you know, one can laugh at Machiavelli's advice, but here you have a good public servant like Mitt Romney going to benefit by the same sort of mentality.
Just an excellent point. He's saying, if you tax them, they're not going to like you.
They're not going to like the tax, but if you can get private fundraising and can put on a good show, a good party for everybody, it might catapult you to be quite famous.
Oh, and put on a good party with other people's money. Put on a
yeah,
good party.
with other
Appear
people's money.
very generous when it's other people's money.
That's right.
John.
So he wouldn't be opposed to, say, a strategy where, I mean, you really shower praise upon someone or shower them with gifts in order to gain their favor in a lot of ways.
Well, again, maybe I'm overplaying this thing, but I was just thinking of the modern day world. You know, like if you're going to do it, make sure the TV is there, and make sure the cameras are rolling and everybody knows about your gift. Don't do it just because it's a good thing to do. You know, none of this private stuff. You know, make a big thing about it.
No anonymous donations.
Yeah, if you're going to make a donation, make sure it's not anonymous. Make sure that your name's on it.
Well, I think about, you know, you turn on TV and let's use radio. You turn on radio and they have this big giveaway that if the 10th caller, you can win a CD. And they hype it up like it's the biggest thing in the world. Well, it's only like $10 or $14 thing. And this radio station makes millions of dollars. You know, so it's like nothing. But the way they hype it up, it's a big thing. So I think if you're going to do something good, hype it up, make it sound really impressive. And the poor blokes that are out there in the public, oh, well, that person really cares.
Oh, I love these examples. And then for the next 4 days on the radio, yeah, and we gave away a CD to, you know, you
That's
keep
right.
reminding people of your generosity.
That's right, yeah. And,
He's like,
in reality, it meant nothing either. I mean, if you're in the radio business, I managed a college radio station for a few years, and all these things are sent to you free of charge. I mean, to give away these things is no cost whatsoever because there are all these promotional things. And so, I don't know, I find a lot of the stuff that Machiavelli talked about are very alive and real in the current world. I'll pick on Cassie here a little bit. Cassie, do you know of any students that want to manipulate the system at UVSC?
Wait, what?
Said by name?
Oh, no. Sure, yeah.
I mean, it's not unheard of at other colleges where somebody might say, well, I'm going to get that instructor that's really pretty easy. I'm going to sign up for that class. Or if maybe I can cut corners here a little bit. Maybe I can flatter the instructor and tell him how great he or she is. Maybe I'll pad my grade a little bit here, a little bit, and different things. So, yeah, just applying these principles at a different level, they're very alive and real.
They absolutely are. In fact, Lloyd, do you have any comments for us on that?
As I was reading this, I was thinking of, you know, lately in the news, every now and then you hear, right now you're especially hearing about governmental leaders or other people who set up foundations to make it look like they're helping out society, but in reality these foundations are really just set up to help them avoid taxes and whatnot. And so in a sense they are taxing other people without those people knowing they're being taxed, and at the same time making it look like they're being generous. And so they're, in a lot of ways, just fulfilling Machiavelli's ideal right here.
And it's exactly what he's going to say is acceptable for the prince. And tax structures are now set up to protect those who are wealthy in business as well, and making sure that they appear to be generous, but there's certainly a lot of publicity that goes along with that generosity.
Again, yeah, maybe I'm making more of it, but I think one has to understand that in 1500, you had a lot of small principalities that were all competing against each other and maneuvering against each other. And in fact, I think the world is returning that way a little bit, like with the breakup of the Soviet Union, and we've had more and more countries being created, interestingly, as opposed to moving together. And so there's that world of competition and give and take and maneuvering there that is probably as important today as it was in 1500.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, especially, just going along with that, especially in Italy at the time of Machiavelli. I mean, the Medici family was kind of a ruling family, but there were a lot of other families that were all kind of competing for power, and this is where Machiavelli is writing from, and there's all this maneuvering going on for political power. So just to...
Yeah, it affected all sorts of people, like the artists of the day. I mean, they would be, you know, underwritten by these famous families, and then if they were on the inside, they were right there in Florence or whatever, but then they would have to spend time outside of Florence if they fell out of favor and different things. And Da Vinci is a perfect example of that. So it was a fascinating time of history when this was written, and I think it's important to understand that.
It is. And in fact, he underlines this just a little more. So Aaron, would you read this for us, please?
Not worry about being called a miser. A prince, therefore, unable to use this virtue of generosity in a manner which will not harm himself if he is known for it, should, if he is wise, not worry about being called a miser.
And continue.
For with time he will come to be considered more generous once it is evident that, as a result of his parsimony, his income is sufficient. He can defend himself from anyone who makes war against him, and he can undertake enterprises without overburdening his people, so that he comes to be generous with all those from whom he takes nothing, who are countless, and miserly with all those to whom he gives nothing, who are few.
Thank you. So it kind of underlines that point. Anything you'd like to add to it, Erin?
Well, I think it was something I was kind of alluding to with the previous quote on generosity, that that he's warning that while one should seem generous, one should also not be doing that at the expense necessarily of these other things. And in doing so, what he's saying is that, you know, if the people know they don't have to worry that the minute something goes wrong, you're going to tax them to the brink of extinction, then they're going to consider that generous of you. And so I think he's opting for a different kind of generosity than necessarily the bread and circuses we were talking about.
And he's going to say they'll really respect you when they see you've got reserves for the battle, that we really needed it now, and you'd held back, and you didn't have to excessively tax us at that time, and we were strong.
That's right.
But that also might mean that you're being called a miser in the times of plenty, that you're holding back, is what he's saying. And he says, don't worry about that people don't recognize that. They probably don't have as much forethought, they're just peasants or serfs or whatever, but nonetheless, I mean, I think what he's alluding to is that to be called a miser in the time of plenty is to be generous in a time of lean.
That's nice, Erin. Thank you. And Cassie?
Somehow that doesn't quite fit Machiavelli's thinking, though. I don't know.
It's too nice, isn't it?
It's too nice. I mean, it's just that we're being miserly now, so that when times get tough, we'll have money in the in the till.
Well, when times get tough, I'll have money in the till.
I was just thinking about in business terms of this, and how if someone was a miser, you'd be more likely to want to be partners with them. And the first thing that came to mind is, I don't know, maybe not applicable, but I thought so. You are looking for a roommate, and instead of having a roommate that is always generous with their money, always, you know, taking friends out to eat or doing nice things for friends, you're going to want a roommate who is really tight with their money, and you know that they're going to pay rent, you know they're going to pay utilities, you know that they're not going to go blow it all and not have any money to pay rent. Yeah.
So you're calculating these things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure you're calculating these things whenever you put together a budget for the university.
I haven't thought about it that way. I guess so. I was thinking of this quote fitting trickle-down economics. You know, that if you keep taxes really low and yet spend money on the military, that this just fits perfectly kind of the current strategy in Washington, D.C., is to cut taxes wherever possible, and ultimately people have money in their pocket and they'll think nicely of you, as opposed to a more liberal approach in expenditures. Now I've got to rethink this about the college. Come back to me in a while with that on the college.
That's all right, because we're going to move right on into to not being hated.
Oh, well.
So would you read this one for us, Lloyd?
Yeah. And above all other things, a prince must guard himself against being despised and hated, and generosity leads you to both one and the other. So it is wiser to live with the reputation of a miser, which produces reproach without hatred, than to be forced to incur the reputation of rapacity, which produces reproach along with hatred, because you want to be considered as generous.
Okay, thanks. So he's coming back to appearances here then, isn't he? What else would you like to say about this quote?
Well, going along just with what we were saying before, it's important to at least appear that you're being generous. Even if you're not being generous, you let the people know, the reason I'm not being generous is because I'm doing this for you. So my not giving is really giving, and it's kind of like a double think in a lot of ways, where you're doing one thing and portraying it as something completely the opposite.
Very good. Did you have a comment, John?
Well, I like what Lloyd just said there with doublethink in reference to Orwell, and I think a lot of people have a tendency to look at this stuff and think that, you know, the consequences of it are very Orwellian, and I don't think that should be ignored. So I just like that Lloyd said that.
Oh, good. Well, I think we're going to continue on this theme. So would you read our next couple of graphics for us?
Yes. On cruelty and mercy. I say that every prince must desire to be considered merciful and not cruel. Nevertheless, He must take care not to misuse this mercy.
And let's read the next one as well to keep it in context.
Okay, cruelty and loyalty. Therefore, a prince must not worry about the reproach of cruelty when it is a matter of keeping his subjects united and loyal. For with a very few examples of cruelty, he will be more compassionate than those who, out of excessive mercy, permit disorders to continue, from which arise murders and plundering. For these usually harm the community at large, while the executions that come from the prince harm one individual in particular.
Okay, and one last graphic on this that helps pull it all in context. So would you read this one as well, John?
Yes. Better to be loved or feared. From this arises an argument, whether it is better to be loved than to be feared, or the contrary. I reply that one should like to be both one and the other, but since it is difficult to join them together, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved, when one of the two must be lacking.
Okay, so Aaron, he starts us with cruelty and mercy and then moves us to this dichotomy of loved and feared. Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, I keep being reminded of a story I recently heard about General Washington.
Uh-huh.
And in hearing this story, to put it a little in context, it's 1776. The Continental Army is in dire straits, and what is left of the army, which I believe is now somewhere in New Jersey, is running amok. And they have all kinds of infractions and cowardice and just rampant problems. There are 7 men who have been called up on these infractions and who are set to be executed. And General Washington goes through all the motions of preparing for their execution. He has the nooses put there, has them put around their necks, has them all marched out, the whole bit. And at the very last moment, pardons 6. Not 7, 6. And has the one man killed. Now, I don't know if he was the worst. I don't know what his infraction was. But the point was, he was trying to court this fine line between loved and feared. He had to do something with his army because he couldn't have the current state continue. Here they were taking on the largest army in the world, and the British were known for their complete regimented control over their soldiers, and here he had this ragtag bunch for the most part, and so he executes 6. He pardons 6 and executes 1, so he can remain feared to some extent, but also, I think, court that kind of love from his army.
Your example ties in so well with what President Cederberg said earlier too, that this is such a good manual for the armed forces, that it comes back to saying, you might not do this to your people, your regular subjects, but boy, when it comes down to your army, there are things that you must do to keep them in line. And at that point, he doesn't even care if you're hated by them.
Yeah.
But he says, so it's a good example, especially when you're talking about the troops. President?
I was just going to add, listening to this right now made me think of President Bush and Guantanamo and the prisoners there, that he would say, we don't really care about the civil rights of those prisoners or the conditions because of the threat to the polity generally. And so, I think that would just fit perfectly in here, that say, well, let's make an example of that, and we'll be cruel and unjust perhaps on an individual basis, but we're going to protect the larger population by doing that. I think this series of quotes is really at the very heart of Machiavelli. And it's a great little combination here of the 3 things that everybody wants to be loved, but in governing you really need to, or in running a large business, you need to not be overly concerned about that. You need to get the job done, and so you need to instill a little bit of fear at the same time that you're seeking approval.
And it's very lonely at the top then.
Well, it can be, I guess, yeah. But I'm thinking of just a very practical sort of thing. For example, firing somebody. We don't today take them out and shoot somebody, but if somebody is dysfunctional within the organization, you will need from time to fire somebody. And you don't want to do it unjustly, but yet a periodic firing can help keep your whole organization functioning more efficiently than if nobody is ever fired. If the organization, let's say UVSC, has a reputation of never letting anybody go, regardless of how they mess up, because we're so concerned about their impact on their personal life, the organization will become very lethargic and very inefficient and very weighed down by these individuals. So there's a lot of applications in the business world to this this issue of being loved as opposed to being respected.
And your test questions will definitely come from this section as well. So,
So pay attention, everybody. Don't pay attention to my answer.
Oh, but, your answer was perfect.
No,
yes.
I don't know about that, but it is really very fascinating. Scott Peck, who's a well-known theologian, has written a lot about civility within organizations. And one of the points he makes about civility is to separate an organization from family. Sometimes people will say, well, we at UVSC are just one big family. And Scott Peck would say that's just not true whatsoever. Family are people that you can't get rid of no matter what you do, okay? No matter how bad John acts up here, his parents are still going to like him probably. You know, you see these mothers, some guys just raped 10 people and shot another 20 or something, and the mother will be on, oh, Johnny was such a great kid. Family can't get rid of it. Not you, Johnny. Not you, Johnny. Lloyd. Don't pick a Lloyd. But it's, you know, you have to separate that. So if it's civility within an organization is to really make sure everybody contributes to the organization in some way. And so you need to have a little bit of fear along with a positive reinforcement.
Oh, I like that very much. In fact, let's go ahead and pull up our next quote then and see how this ties in with what the president's just mentioned to us. And would you read this, Cassie?
Less chance of harm by those that fear you. Men are less hesitant about harming someone who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared, because love is held together by a chain of obligation which, since men are a sorry lot, is broken on every occasion in which their own self-interest is concerned. But fear is held together by a dread of punishment which will never abandon you.
Okay. Lloyd, tell me a little bit about that.
It's just scary, but it's going along with what we've been talking about, how, and with President Seaberg mentioned that companies, and I've seen companies like that, where they have actual policies that they're supposed to have a certain number of people out the door on a constant basis, and it creates a fear. You know, you can love, and he says you can love someone and they'll love you back and it'll work for so long, but it doesn't last. But if they're scared, they'll always fall in line.
In fact, in other sections of the Prince, he talks about that you're really stupid if you think you have friends, because he says, don't ever trust these human bonds, these friendship bonds, because they'll only get you in trouble.
You know, for fear of sounding cold-hearted or something, I see that a lot at tops of organizations. You know, we talked about a little bit lonely at the top. But you'll find that presidents, governors, other political leaders, it is very hard to really have true friends in that situation, because you're never sure to what extent people are trying to manipulate you for this, that, or another reason. Or conversely, you're often the possessor of information that no one else happens to have. And it really causes difficulties in developing true friends when you're in these kind of leadership positions. So my guess is that if George Bush were to walk in, the President of the United States, and we're sitting down here, we would probably not act the same to President Bush that we would act sitting around a dinner table among friends just chatting. Well, Mr. President, you know, how are you today? And boy, you really look great on TV. You know, we'd all be kissing up and stuff like that. We would say, well, how about supporting a little money for UVSC or whatever, student financial aid? What can you do, President, about student financial aid? It's a little bit of this veneer of phoniness that goes on at the top. And so Machiavelli speaks right to that. And of course, I enjoy the thing about men are a sorry lot, which gets back to that Hobbesian interpretation of the world.
Yep, and he's just going to say, they're self-interested, you better be self-interested too. Yes. Well, let's read that next quote for us, will you, John?
Cause fear without hatred. A prince must nevertheless make himself feared in such a manner that he will avoid hatred, even if he does not acquire love, since to be feared and not to be hated can very well be combined. And this will always be so when he keeps his hands of the property and the women of his citizens as his subjects.
Okay. In fact, when he goes on this one, he says, it's okay if you end up murdering somebody, but don't ever get into a person's property or their woman.
Then the quote of our call goes even further and talks about equating maintaining property and needing occasionally to beat women to keep them in line. So.
Oh yeah, that is a very cruel portion of it.
See Aaron really boiling.
Yeah, go ahead, Aaron. Give us your thoughts, Aaron.
I'm sorry. No, it's interesting because it oddly enough is jumping straight from that earlier, the quote we just read just before that about causing fear without hatred and the less chance of harm from those that fear you, that don't love you. If you already assume that initial premise that all people are self-interested and initially bad or not good, and if you're in the 1500s and women are even lesser human beings than men are, and men are initially bad, what does that say about women? That says nothing positive about women. But nonetheless, I think that when we're talking about Machiavelli, that you have to understand his initial premises that people are all self-interested, like you brought up, President, that people are all possessed of this negative quality.
Thank you. Did you have a comment you wanted to make, John?
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm really happy we've progressed beyond this point. It's right here.
We hope. We hope.
Yeah, but he gives us advice numerous times in the complete work when you're looking at that.
An interesting distinction for the business world, I think, is that this concept of being loved as opposed to being feared. I think that love is generally a concept that can be applied on a very interpersonal level. But yet what he's writing about is kind of the policy level and management level. Mm-hmm. And their exercising power is more the name of the game. And love is just restricted to something that's between two individuals. And so it's really kind of taken out of this thing. So forget about being loved, because that's entirely a different realm.
Yes.
You're never going to be loved. We may grow to love whomever is governor or president or whatever, but we don't really know them that well. Mm-hmm. So the issue is respecting them or admiring them or understanding them, but not necessarily loving them. So I think this, again, is one of those central quotes about Machiavelli.
Oh, great. And then we move into another central quote on Machiavelli, and this is about that a wise leader need not keep their word, number 279. And Lloyd, could you read that one for us, please?
Yeah. A wise ruler, therefore, cannot and should not keep his word when such an observance of faith would be to his disadvantage, and when the reasons which made him promise are removed. And if men were all good, this rule would not be good. But since men are a sorry lot and will not keep their promises to you, you likewise need to keep yours to them.
Okay, so you don't need to keep your promises to your subjects. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Cassie?
Yeah, I was just going to say the golden rule is not in play here at all. It's just such little faith in mankind in general, and just that kind of Hobbesian point of view.
But Cassie, don't you think that things change when there's a little clause in here that said when the reasons changed?
Let's see, where's that?
It says here that
if people
when
were all
the
good.
reasons that made him promise are removed, so that if you're promised under condition, but those situation has totally changed now, then why foolishly keep your word?
Yeah.
And that's for the ethics class here.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the ethics of that? If I say I'm going to do something, is it ethical to suddenly change and not do it?
I don't think it is, and I think that we're very disconcerted even when we see that in our governmental leaders, that we're surprised and shocked and say, well, I'm not entitled to do that, so why should our leaders? And he doesn't want you to get busted doing this. He doesn't want you to get caught. So would you read that one for us, Aaron, the next one?
But it is necessary to know how to disguise this nature well and to be a great hypocrite and a liar. And men are so simple-minded and so controlled by their present necessities that one who deceives will always find another who will allow himself to be deceived. Therefore, it is not necessary for a prince to have all of the above-mentioned qualities, but it is very necessary for him to appear to have them.
Okay, and in fact, let's continue this point with the next one on how, and so he needs to appear. So he continues with this, Cassie.
How a prince should appear to be. A prince, therefore, must be very careful never to let anything slip from his lips, which is not full of the 5 qualities mentioned above. He should appear, upon seeing and hearing him, to be all mercy, all faithfulness, all integrity, all kindness, all religion.
Okay, so President, so he's saying that a ruler doesn't need to keep his word, a wise ruler, and but don't get caught. Don't let people know this about you. And he says you must have the highest of appearances. Tell us a little bit about this.
You look at me for this.
Yeah,
Tell us about
well,
this.
because actually we've just got about a minute left.
minute
So
left,
yeah,
right,
so we're letting you have the last word on
Oh my
Machiavelli.
goodness, Sam. Well, I think again it shows that separation between the pragmatic world of how do you operate in a world of moral free, an amoral world. How do you maneuver in that practical world, and yet to be totally liked and maintain your power, you need to give the image of all these 5 qualities. And I see it again played out in the media age today, even more important than ever. That when the cameras are rolling, every president we've ever had has always been seen on church on Sunday mornings. And if you really make it, you can be like Jimmy Carter and teach Sunday school or something like that. And so how you present yourself, you have that persona, that's the public persona. But beneath that public persona, you have somebody that has to make things happen in the practical, real world, filled with the sorry people. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think that's the summary of it.
Oh, it's the perfect summary for our class today, and thanks so much for being with us. This was just great. You were so helpful.
It's a great class, and thanks to the students here.
Thank you. Thank you. It just ends so